it water with the sheep in the box?
The phrase "power corrupts" is a common one, used so frequently that it's become a sort of truism, mostly accepted as fact for the most part, but is it true? And crucially, if it is true, why is it true, and what can we do about it? Well, that's what I want to discuss today, in what will probably accidentally end up being a kind of anarchist manifesto, though that's not my real intention. It does seem like an inevitability, to be perfectly honest, at least judging by the way most societies throughout history have turned out, and how politicians have historically acted and continue to act to this day. In fact, a common refrain among more cynical parties is that the problem is unsolvable because power attracts the sort of people likely to abuse it, because, well, why would you seek it out if that wasn't the case? This was the motivation behind the various attempts to enact a functional system of sortition, otherwise known as demarchy, among others throughout history, more on those later. And of course, our current system of representative democracy was originally implemented to attempt to mitigate the absolute power and potential absolute corruption of the monarchy, though due to the relationship between capital and power, which is a natural end result of capitalism, this didn't exactly go to plan, and we have at best an oligarchy and a select group of leaders from the same classes and families who all went to the same schools and so on. So, does power corrupt? Are the corrupt drawn to power, or both? Let's discuss it, shall we? There is a commonly held belief among people on the right and centre of the political compass, which is based on essentially zero evidence other than confirmation bias, that it is human nature to be selfish, individualistic and competitive, since in prehistoric times, as well as in the animal kingdom, often there is competition over, for example, territory or resources between tribes or different species, just as there is today under capitalism. Therefore, capitalism is just the natural order of things. Right? Well, that's the whole can of worms I'll cover briefly in the next section, but the short answer, as I've discussed a few times before, is no. For a start, just because something is natural and animals do it, that doesn't make it automatically good or just. A lot of rape and murder happens in the animal kingdom and even in our own prehistoric cultures, but that doesn't make rape and murder acceptable or mean that just because it happens in the natural world we must emulate it. Living in houses isn't natural, the internet isn't natural, hospitals aren't natural. Being natural doesn't mean shit, quite frankly, and if we stuck with what's natural, then we'd all be anprims dying of easily preventable diseases and living in mud huts, but that's not really the main point of contention here. See, the fact of the matter is that even if we do accept that not only is it a good thing to follow the natural order, human nature is not competitive, as the capitalists and individualists would like you to believe, but cooperative. We may have worked hard in hunting prey, defended ourselves against aggressors and fought with neighbouring tribes from time to time, but for the most part, prehistoric human civilizations were cooperative and probably closer in nature to the kind of communist society that many people today can only dream of. The weak, elderly, disabled and infirm were cared for, the strong provided for the weak, and rather than competing with and attempting to harm those in need, early human societies were built primarily on compassion and equality and, crucially, did not have an authoritarian leader but were mostly governed by the collective. Likewise, a lot of the aforementioned competitiveness was specifically because prehistoric humans were forced to fight to survive. In our modern world, in which, if we allocated resources adequately, we could end the scarcity that forced our ancestors to act in this competitive way, this would no longer be a factor. Whilst I disagree with them, and in many ways believe them to be misguided, the anprims probably do have a point here, in that many a prehistoric primitive lifestyle does have its benefits, and could even perhaps be preferable to our current modern system of neoliberal capitalism, but I think that the lack of access to, for example, running water and advanced medical services is too much of an issue to overlook. Capitalism, as I think I've made clear in previous videos, is to blame for a lot of the world's problems right now. Specifically, as things are right now, capitalism relies on competitiveness, individualism, and hierarchy. It also creates a situation in which power guarantees wealth, and wealth guarantees power. Under capitalism, the people in charge of the largest companies and who lead the world in personal wealth get to dictate the terms of the economy, and just society in general, for the rest of us. In short, power encourages hierarchy, and capital is the ultimate ultimate leadership. The unhealthy thing about all of this is that due to the fact that capital has much more sway over our lives, these traits and these tendencies get drummed into us from an early age and lasting our entire lives, which makes sense if we exist in a society that relies on these traits, but it does mean that it's rather difficult to break this programming and see things objectively or even consider an alternative. As that old quote goes, it's easier for most people to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, and that's by design. Don't want people to be educated on better alternatives to the system keeping you in power, right? As I just mentioned, we know from studying history, and specifically primitive Paleolithic and Neolithic human societies, that hierarchy is not inherent or the natural way of things. In fact, for the most part, the opposite is true. Capitalism forces us to try to dominate and be better than others in ways that often aren't possible and definitely aren't healthy, whereas obviously the preferable way of living, which is discouraged by an individualistic society built on competition, is to find meaning and happiness on our own terms, living our lives according to what we believe is important. Self-improvement rather than domination of others, an alien concept for many in our current system. Ironically enough, this is why socialism is more suited to protecting and venerating the rights of the individual, by valuing people with all their variety, eccentricity and traits, rather than trying to force them to conform or exist within the capitalist system even when they're unable to, or struggle to do so. And as a person with a disability, I can tell you firsthand that this expectation is inhumane and unfair. We're able to accept them as individuals with unique needs, but also unique skills and things to offer, rather than shaving off their corners and turning them into dispensable cogs in the capitalist machine. Ironically enough, it's collectivism that preserves the rights of the individual more effectively than individualism. The success or failure of a society is from the ground up. Without the majority, the workers, society crashes to a halt, and yet capitalism attempts to teach us the opposite. Success in society, we are told, is because of the people at the top of the capitalist hierarchy. It is by their goodwill that we have the prosperity we enjoy. Just don't think too much about it. It's interesting to me that those who claim to care most about the individual are the first to throw them into situations that harm individual liberties and overall happiness, rather than the collectivists who value people as people and not for where they happen to find themselves on the capitalist hierarchy. Almost as if individualists fetishize the concept of the individual whilst not actually giving a shit about, individual people. I would argue that without capitalism, we would have less need for and less motivation to have a rigid hierarchy, and the equal distribution of resources would likely eliminate the need for competition, unlike whatever shite individualist thinkers might like to believe. As a result, it probably shouldn't be a surprise that in a system in which the power resides with the rich and privileged, in which there is a symbiotic relationship between capital and government, the corruption can take hold. After all, money can make the difference between a comfortable or destitute existence, and the government has the ability to change regulations or cut taxes on the super rich and corporations, so it's frankly inevitable that after a certain point, corruption would occur, because capitalism encourages greed, and if you're in power, you're likely to be ambitious as it is. So honestly, what's to disincentivize politicians taking bribes or lobbying to become commonplace? The rich hold the power, and they want to be able to work their employees to death and pay zero taxes, and politicians want a comfortable life and also the support of a massive powerful corporation, since so much about a politician's life revolves around money. Those campaigns cost a fucking ton, remember, and the primary goal of a politician is not to help people or improve the world in any way, and especially not the lives of the working class, but to be re-elected, which the backing of a corporation helps to facilitate. So what's to stop such a system naturally occurring? Honour? Duty, a sense of community spirit? Those things are hard to come by in a society built around ruthless individualism and the veneration of hierarchy. They do exist, of course, but they're heavily discouraged and repressed. And if someone with rigid principles and a desire to do good does somehow find themselves in a position of relative power, they will be highly resisted and opposed, because under capitalism, the rich also own the media and, as such, have huge levels of control over people's perceptions of various politicians. Look how much shit Jeremy Corbyn got, not only from the rich, the press and the government, but the higher-ups in his own party, for fuck's sake. The system is set up to exclusively benefit capital and those with all the power, and anyone looking to shake the system up, or even the playing field out a little, is ruthlessly attacked, and honestly, these attacks are mostly successful because the rich hold all the power, so no shit. The system perpetuates itself and resists reform. So, What can we do about it?
Welcome to Tuesday's live National Lottery Thunderball draw, which is taking place in front of an independent adjudicator.
One potential solution to the intoxicating and corrupting nature of the way our power structures are currently laid out is the little-known concept of sortition. What is sortition, you may ask? Well, put simply, it's a political system under which the offices of government are treated not like some kind of hierarchical inevitability, a class of people above the rest of us who get to make the rules, but more of a necessary public service that anyone can be chosen at random to perform for a set period of time, much like the jury system, which was probably most famously attempted in ancient Athens, wherein magistrates were chosen at random. And interestingly enough, despite Athenian democracy being cited as the ancestor and inspiration for our modern democratic systems, the Athenians considered direct democracy to be, ironically, anti-democratic. In fact, Aristotle himself once wrote that democracy arose from the idea that those who are equal in any respect are equal absolutely. All are alike free, therefore they claim that all are free absolutely. The next is when the Democrats, on the grounds that they are all equal, claim equal participation in everything. It is accepted as democratic when public offices are allocated by lot, and as oligarchic when they are filled by election. The Athenians believed sortition to be democratic, but not elections, and used complex procedures with purpose-built allotment machines, known as cleritaria, to avoid the corrupt practice used by oligarchs to buy their way into office. The system was fascinating, as to be eligible to be chosen by lot, citizens self-selected themselves into the available pool and their lotteries in the cleritaria machines. Those chosen by lot generally remained in office for around 1 year and could only do so once in their lifetime. There were issues, of course, such as the fact that it was only men over the age of 30 who could apply, but that aside, as a concept it's pretty great in my opinion. Sadly, sortition has very rarely been attempted since then, and basically not at all in the modern world, outside of selecting juries, for example, and honestly, from the perspective of anyone with the power to implement it, where's the motivation? Probably the best summation of this concept was by Terry Pratchett in his excellent book Guards, paraphrased because I couldn't find the exact quote even after hours of looking, in which he states that the rightful heir to the throne returning to save the kingdom narrative is damaging because whilst that king may be good and just, for the most part because they grew up in an ordinary environment, not being primed for leadership, and most of the time don't know that they're destined for greatness or to become some great ruler, which means that their ambition for power usually doesn't exist, and they have to prove themselves to the people through some act of great heroism rather than having the right family lineage. But that only works for one generation, because whilst that one good king might have been good and just and related and empathized with their subjects due to their background as a lonely peasant who was uplifted to power and privilege rather than being born into it, one of the main points of royalty is to continue the royal line by producing heirs, and those heirs are naturally going to be less able to relate and empathize due to having lived their entire lives in the royal bubble, thus potentially creating bad kings. Likewise, when it comes to democracy, the sort of people who seek out power are likely to be those who probably shouldn't, and once it becomes clear that politics is a lucrative career path and getting into it takes a lot of strategy and logistics, well, it stops being the case that the people who should be in power and want to make the world a better place are the ones who actually get there, and starts being that the people who are more persuasive, cunning and charismatic, and an entire industry of political strategy starts to appear, creating a pipeline through which the powerful can put their kids, coupled with the fact that after a certain amount of time it ends up being those in power who make the rules about who gets to be in power, and you end up with a situation in which a majority of MPs have more in common with one another than the people they're supposed to be representing. And the ruling party pretty much all went to the same schools and universities. Of course, one of the main reasons the Athenians liked sortition was because they believed that the fates and the gods would intervene and make sure that nothing bad would happen during this process, but really, is that any different to the divine right of kings, or Theresa May believing that God would help her during the Brexit negotiations? The system evidently worked, unless you're willing to say that Aristotle is full of shit, but you better be pretty hard because I hear he doesn't take insults like that lightly. It's for this reason that many anarchists such as myself and anarcho-capitalists who don't understand that capitalism is a hierarchy dislike the idea of hierarchy in general, because not only is it inherently unjust to give one person power over another, but also it's clear that giving people power is essentially handing them an excuse to abuse it, especially if there's a pre-prepared path for the rich to push their kids into positions of power. They absolutely will take advantage of it and create a situation in which only a certain class of people end up in charge, and all of a sudden we have a pseudo-aristocracy via oligarchy, which likes to pretend that it's actually a democracy. The idea of technocracy or epistocracy, which technically are different things but they're similar enough to lump them together here, so when I say technocracy sometimes I do mean epistocracy, just FYI, is often suggested as a potential solution to the problem of corrupting power and for a great many things besides that are wrong with our society, often pushed by liberals and centrists who, as we previously discussed, are more than happy to accept tyranny if they think it might benefit them, often in response to absolute morons like Michael Gove saying shit like "we've had enough of experts" during the Brexit debate.
The chief exec of the NHS and most of the leaders of the trade unions in Britain all say that you, Boris and Nigel are wrong. Why should the public trust you over them?
I'm not asking the public to trust me, I'm asking the public to trust themselves. I'm asking the British public to take back control of our destiny from those organisations which are distant, unaccountable, elitist and don't have their own interests at heart.
Elitist.
Absolutely.
Because the Lord High Chancellor, conspiracy of elites. It sounds like something like Wolf Hall.
Well, I haven't seen Wolf Hall, but the one thing that I would say is that the people who are backing the Remain campaign are people who've done very well, thank you, out of the European Union, and the people increasingly, absolutely. The people who are arguing that we should get out are concerned to ensure that the working people of this country at last get a fair deal. I think the people in this country have had enough of experts with organisations from acronyms.
The people of this country have had enough of experts.
From organisations with acronyms saying that they know what is best and getting it consistently wrong.
And of course a compromise. After all, what's more of a middle ground than just letting the experts make all the decisions? The left is always pushing the government to take the facts and science into consideration when making policy, and why not centre our society around cold hard facts rather than ideology? Well, before we answer that question, let's briefly go over what technocracy actually is and might look like. Technocracy is, as mentioned, a system of government in which representatives are selected on the basis of their knowledge in a given area of responsibility, particularly with regard to scientific or technical knowledge. This system explicitly contrasts with the knowledge that elected representatives should be the primary decision makers in government, which is about as anti-democratic as it gets, and essentially creates a caste system, but more on that in a moment. Proponents of technocracy often claim that under such a paradigm, concern could be given to sustainability and facts within the resource base instead of monetary profitability or potential bigotry or other harmful ideologies. This idea may seem familiar to those of you who have read up on a lot of political theory, specifically when it comes to more libertarian or ANCAP-leaning ideas, because it's very similar to the nonsense idea of meritocracy that I covered ages ago and continue to refer to this day, even though the original video doesn't even have that many views, so most of you probably don't remember it. And you would be right, because in theory, a technocratic system is one in which the most able are in charge, ostensibly without the influence of special interest groups or ideologies. The problem, of course, other than the fact that this flies in the face of the very idea of democracy, is that this attempt to replace ideology with facts and logic simply doesn't make sense. Facts and evidence are incredibly important, but the interpretation and response to these facts is the important part. See, ideology isn't just some obstacle we need to overcome, but a driving force for getting things done. Even if you take out all the corruption, lobbyists, self-serving bureaucrats and bigots from government, facts on their own will not help make decisions unless there's an ideology pushing them forward, and then we're back to square one, because presumably not only will these technocrats disagree on political issues, but also data cannot prescribe policy without some kind of overarching philosophy. Let's use an example. Let's take gay marriage. Statistically, and based on a lot of prior evidence, legalizing gay marriage would have brought a lot of joy to a lot of people, and there's no scientific reason not to legalize it. However, in order to make that decision, you would have to agree that LGBTQ+ people are valid and deserve happiness, which facts cannot give you. That's a philosophical and moral position based on the conviction that the purpose of government is to maximize happiness, and that gay marriage is a positive thing to push for. Experts and scientists can be bigots, and due to a number of systemic issues, they are disproportionately cis-het white men, meaning that they may not really be best placed to talk about, for example, LGBTQ+ or women's issues. Furthermore, and I cannot believe I actually have to say this, empathy is important. Statistics don't often tell the whole story, and relying exclusively on logic rather than any kind of empathy or idealism can be dangerous. After all, in theory, we could set up a system in which, say, 5% of the population is treated brutally and enslaved in order to provide abundance and wealth to the other 95% of people. Statistically, that would make a large amount of people happy and content. but morally and ethically, obviously, it's monstrous. Plus, realistically, very little would actually change. If we keep in place the existing governmental frameworks, the people in power are just as susceptible to temptation and corruption, and on a long enough timescale, all that needs to happen is rather than putting their kids through Eton and politics courses in Oxford and Cambridge, the ruling classes can just switch and get them to take STEM degrees instead, and the pathway to power is still active, it's just shifted slightly. After all, if you need a PhD to gain power, that's disproportionately going to be made up of upper-class white kids due to systemic problems, and as I just mentioned, having access to, and even a deep understanding of, the facts doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to act on them, especially if you have more to gain from ignoring them. Oh, and of course being highly educated in one field of study is fine, but it doesn't give you any kind of insight into other areas, and as a politician you need to be able to make decisions about a number of varied and complex issues. So if you're only an expert on, for example, biochemistry, then that gives you a lot of authority when talking about pharmaceutical policies, but what if there's another recession and a decision has to be made about the economy? Or do the economists just get to unilaterally decide what the response should be? Because if recent history has taught us anything, is that economists can be wrong, and when they are, but their advice is followed anyway, disaster can and does strike. Besides, what makes a minority of people qualified to lead a majority? They can make decisions without oversight and without having to worry about their actions causing immense harm to the populace, because they can't exactly be voted out, and then of course we get into the same issues any dictatorship or authoritarian regime faces. I suppose you could just say that democracy stays, but in order to be eligible to gain office, you have to be above a certain level of education or experience. But then we're just back to square one, but with slightly smarter oligarchs.
Fully automated. Fully automated. Fully automated. Luxury gauge state communism.
You knew it was headed in this direction. I'm not particularly interested in discussing how we get there because it's a whole thing with 1,000 conflicting ideas all vying for recognition, and to be honest I could make it its own video, though I'm not actually sure which I'd end up supporting because a lot of them have potential. Besides, we didn't really discuss practicality in getting to the point where the system takes hold in the previous example, so let's just set it aside for now. In the simplest possible terms, communism is a stateless, classless, moneyless society, or as Glenn Beck puts it,
communism is not the bad one. If you actually look at the theories of Marx, communism is the utopia. The communism only happens when we all live in a happy commune and we're all saying, oh, you know what, I'll give you my stuff, don't worry about it. And there's no big boss, there's no guns because you don't need it, because everyone has come to this communist or commune idea and we all want to be there. So communism is the utopia.
So, as you can probably guess, this will be quite a short section, but of course without hierarchy, without competition, without false manufactured scarcity engineered to keep capitalism going, without inequality, and without the need for leadership, hierarchy or greed, there cannot be corruption. There cannot be an incentive for those in power to take bribes or work against the interests of wider society, partly because there are no leaders, but also because without scarcity, without money, without power or systemic injustice, there is no need, and certainly no motivation, and crucially, if leaders do exist, or are necessary, which is unlikely, but there is a reason anarchists like to qualify their positions by adding that they advocate for the abolition of unnecessary and unjust hierarchies. Due to the nature of a true communist society, there would be a very simple and effective method of removing them from power, because the entire point is that the people and the workers have ultimate authority, and there should be no systems in place protecting anyone's hold on power if the people decide to remove them. Infinite power. Infinite power. Does power corrupt? Well, yes, it does, but the reason power corrupts is because our society is structured in the way that it is. As we've discussed, the primary factor has been our culture of individualism, competitiveness, and above all, capitalism. In short, power corrupts because we allow it to. We've been over the reasons as to why this happens, as well as a few commonly discussed solutions, but I think it's clear that the only real way to do away with corruption for good is fully automated luxury gay-spaced communism, for the simple reason that rather than try to mitigate or work around the existing problems, it essentially just throws them out and starts from scratch with a more egalitarian outlook and paradigm. Now we just have to get there, and I'll probably make a video about that at some point as well. Once we do away with class, hierarchy and money, we will by necessity eliminate corruption as a result, and then, and only then, will we have Hello everyone, thanks for watching this one. I'm not sure how long it's going to turn out to be, but a lot of work went into this video, even if it is like 20 minutes long, because I had to do a lot of research into the various different kinds of government as well as the philosophy of power. I hope you enjoyed it either way, and thanks again for the 2,000 subscribers. I'm honestly just, my mind is blown over that. If you want to follow me on Twitter, there will be a link in the description. Likewise, if you want to ask me a question on Curious Cat, or if you want to donate any money to me, that would be much appreciated. As you can probably tell, the names on screen right now are the names of the people who do give me money each month, and if you do donate $5 or more to me on Patreon, then you do get extra benefits, like you do get these videos 1 or 2 days early. That is the video essays and the response videos. The shitposty ones I do upload directly as soon as I finish them, especially the ones that are time sensitive, like the Kelly Zahos one. Obviously that drama was going on as I uploaded it, so I couldn't really have delayed it very much. And also I will read out your name at the end of the credits. Allow me to demonstrate. So today I especially want to thank Alice Jade, Calliope, Chris Vegnacci, Emily, Every Jeffstein, Nanza Kambe. Next we have Ryan, Brian, Pixels Green, Stacey Solano, Susie M, Theodore Pekelarov, Thomas McCallum, Tom Newport, and Wikibitch. Thanks so much for watching everyone, and I hope you have a good one. Bye!